So in order for a muscle to actually shorten and contract, it needs to get a signal from the brain, right? The motor neurons. And so the more demand a specific muscle has, the more the body relies on that specific muscle group. Just starting there, that's a good one, because what foam rolling will do is when you hold it on that spot, it is called autogenic inhibition. And essentially it forces the muscle to be so tight that the nervous system's like, way too tight, right? Let's relax here. And so that's typically a good place to start, because once you do that, now the muscle is let go, and now you can actually properly lengthen it.
This video is for educational entertainment purposes only.
Hey everybody, I'm here today with Kaden. Kaden is a posture coach, a mobility expert, and a strong dude. Thanks so much for being with me here today, Kaden.
Appreciate you for having me on, man. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I really liked your content. I feel like you're approaching this topic with some humility. I think a lot of times people talk about posture and it kind of sounds self-righteous, right? Like they know everything and that you have to act a certain way and do certain things. And I think that can be really off-putting. And so that's really why I liked your stuff. So I think maybe if we could start, tell me how you were sort of drawn to this, how you got into this topic, and how you learned what you know.
Yeah. Well, I'd say my first official ever opening my eyes was, flashback to about several years ago. I was preparing for high school football, and I was working with this trainer, and I saw this video talking about, the key to ultimate athletic ability, right? No matter what it is the hips, right? Focus on the hips. And so up to that point, the only way I had ever found success really in anything is high amounts of volume. That was it. And so I applied that there. So I was stretching, doing mobility routines, finding all sorts of YouTube videos 2-3 times per day, right? And not just those little gimmicky, just 2-minute ones. I'm talking heavy mobility. I was really bad at mobility, because especially yoga. I focused a lot on yoga to a point where I would be in a pose, forcing, clenching the teeth, fighting it. And it's I had a yoga instructor at the time. She's like, you don't need to work that hard. It's yoga. The point is to relax. And so I got really mobile really quick. And at first, my trainer even made a comment. He was like, dude, have you been stretching? Your strides look longer. And it was only 3 weeks, 4 weeks into it. And I was like, okay, that's a sign of progress. Yes. And then no. Very quickly, I found out, and this is a saying that I try to really emphasize in a lot of my content, is mobility without stability is injury inevitability. Because very quickly, my strides were getting longer. Yes. I was way more mobile. Yes. However, because there's other elements to posture, it broke down very quickly. And then just to go into a couple other experiences, I did an externship as a medical assistant. And in the externship, I worked in an orthopedic center. And the big thing with the orthopedic center was a lot of people were dealing with posture issues. My eyes were open to what happens long term when posture isn't taken care of at the start. There was a lot of early signs that I learned. And then I actually ended up, I was telling you right before this, I was doing powerlifting for about a year. And out of high school, I went from always running around with football to sitting, lots of commuting, 2 hour commutes, several hour studies. And because of it, I ended up with an anterior pelvic tilt, which we'll probably go into at some point in here, so I won't overemphasize now, but I was out of alignment, and I ended up throwing my back out twice in 2 weeks, and then the third time a couple months later. And so really my own experiences, and then being in that orthopedic center, seeing the long-term effects, brought me to posture.
Totally. That makes sense. So let's talk about it kind of in a broad sense, and then we can drill down into some specific topics. So you used a couple words there. You mentioned mobility. You also talked about flexibility. Can we talk about the difference between mobility and flexibility, and then how you also mentioned stability? How does stability play into both of those things? Is it separate? Is it a variable that, relates to mobility? You tell me.
Yeah. So it was kind of funny when we first connected. This was actually something I was kind of working on a model, because I'm someone who likes to simplify things as much as possible. Because the more I understand the why, the simplicity around it, the better I can explain it to others. And so between mobility and flexibility, so flexibility, we're dealing with passive range of motion from muscles and supporting connective tissue. So essentially, you're not doing any work, right? So the most common example would be touching your toes, right? When you're in that, as long as you're not resisting gravity, gravity is pulling you down and you're just sitting into it. Another example is dancers are really flexible. So if they had a partner that they were, having them pull their foot up towards their head, which I could never do because that hurts to just watch.
No, not at all.
Right. And so that's flexibility. So it's an external force. You're not doing any work, right? It's passive compared to mobility being a step up from there, Mobility is more control. So going back to touching the toes example, Romanian deadlift, even with just body weight, right? As long as you're resisting that range of motion, the hamstrings, right, when they're lengthening, they're still in active engagement. They're not letting you just be kind of pulled apart. Then there's two other things, right, going to tying in stability as well as strength. And so this is all four of these things, right? Flexibility, mobility, strength, stability are kind of what I deem my successful posture while moving model. We go strength and then stability. So strength can even be broken down into two subtopics. So strength, we're talking tensile strength, which is a muscle's resilience in this, right? So if this is like the max amount that a muscle can be lengthened, it's strong right here. Because if it's not strong right here, right now we don't have a hamstring. That kind of sucks. And then we also have contractile strength, which is ability to produce force. So to change up the example here, I got a wall that I'm going to try not to punch here. But with the bicep here, even just resisting gravity, right? We are resisting gravity, producing force, contracting, shortening that muscle against it. So those are the two elements of strength. And then to tie stability into it is basically staying controlled and balanced when things aren't completely balance, right? Things are uncontrollable, right? Because let's say, for example, one of the most common things, this happened to me, right? Picking up a box of kitchen utensils, right? And all the utensils slide to one side, right? But you're in this bent over kind of vulnerable position. So if you don't have very good stability, right? Like your hips are going to start shaking and then boom, you throw out your back or tear a hamstring. And so that's kind of the four different pieces for the movement area.
No, that makes perfect sense. This may be kind of an abstract question, but you talked about strength a lot. And I think anecdotally, this is true for myself, a lot of people I work with. Oftentimes, the stronger you get, the less mobile you actually get, right? You become less, you become overly stable in certain patterns, and thus that creates instabilities elsewhere. So, how should we think about that? Like, what kind of, you define strength in two different ways, but how can we best apply strength or increase strength to ensure we're increasing mobility and stability in the context we want it? And if you want, whatever's easier, like if you want to pick a movement or a person, whatever, that makes the most sense to answer that.
Yeah. So if we're talking, still sticking with the movement, particularly in terms of strength, right? So let's take a common movement pattern that we see in everyday life. So hinging, right? So like a deadlift, right? We can break it down because this is what a lot of posture specialists will look at when we're doing any type of posture assessment is really from head to toe, right? So we're looking at everything. And so let's start, right? We'll say at the base of the feet. And so when we're over the center of mass, right? The center of mass being the point at where we're the most balanced. We have, let's say, the proper arch, right? Because if our foot goes too much, if it inverts too much, right, now we're kind of in an awkward position there. If it everts too much, if we have too much tibial external rotation, so the feet turns out, right? Duck feet, I believe, is the term a lot of people use with that.
I am duck-footed. I know very much about that. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, perfect. This should hit right at home. I love it. Yeah, so I like to, once again, like I said earlier, I like to simplify it as much as possible. So then starting at the base of the feet, there are different exercises. So one is maintaining a good arch. One of my favorite drills for specific example is what's called the short foot drill. We can call it a pendulum swing, if you will. It's where you imagine, right, if this is your foot here, you imagine bringing the arch up as high as you can without curling the toes. So then the focus right here is on those intrinsic foot muscles, right, trying to hold this. We have the flexor, hallucis longus, amongst others. And so staying strong in this position, so that's one that I like. And that gives a lot of, one, we're building on that strong foot arch, right? Strong arch of the foot. And we're also adding the stability, which is what I like is as much as possible, trying not to overcomplicate things, right? I've seen things be overcomplicated in many different terms. And then here trying not to, we don't want to oversimplify it either, because if we spend too much time on those details, 5 hours, 6 hours, okay, cool, we just got halfway through the workout. And so I like to try and take it a piece at a time. And so that's one example for the feet. And then a good example for hips, like let's say hip airplanes. That's another good one. Another one that I like going specifically in that hinging motion is the kickstand Romanian deadlift. So taking a kettlebell in one single hand, going down, and also adding that rotational strength. Because the more we can do it under control, right, controlled chaos, the better we're going to be when it's uncontrolled, kind of going back to that kitchen utensil example. And so as much as possible, trying to combine those. And really when it comes to posture dysfunctions, when we're trying to rebuild someone's posture, I like to start a lot of single leg work as well, because ultimately, another saying that I had one time, and I probably didn't coin this, right? Someone probably said it long before me, but you can't fix a asymmetrical problem with a symmetrical solution. And so one thing that I like to do is do integration in terms of single leg work and doing those kind of kickstand Romanian deadlifts, for example. Because I feel the more we do it single leg, first off, now we can see a lot of any issues that are trying to hide because our body is really good at adapting, right? That's why we see bodybuilders get so big. Same with, like we said, with strength, right? People in the element of strength, they get really big. And so to make sure that those adaptations are most advantageous to us and there's not any hiding, right? Because our body's learned how to move with those dysfunctions. We can see a lot. Because another drill, I think it's called the clat test, if I'm not mistaken. But you'll start on a slightly elevated step stool, and then you'll hop off with one foot. And now you're trying to land with that one foot and see, are we tilting too much this way? Or are we tilting too much that way? And it'll kind of expose which kind of muscles may be weak in that area. And so from a testing perspective, that also helps. But yeah, I think a lot of single leg, single side work, rotational is probably my, we'll call it jam and jelly there when it comes to making sure the strength works for us and not against us, kind of like you were mentioning.
I really like that expression you used about not using a symmetrical solution for an asymmetrical problem. I think that's just kind of a good, I've never heard that before, but that seems just like a good general axiom. I think a lot of times people try to fit the wrong solution for the problem that they think they understand. And like, no matter, if you're pushing, if you're trying to move an immovable object, it doesn't matter how hard you push. You're doing the wrong thing.
Right.
So I think that's a
Right.
good framework. I like that. You also mentioned, just sort of focusing on posture. If someone feels bad, right? They're an office worker, they're a regular human being, they don't know what's going on. Maybe they work out, right? But they're just sort of feeling aches and pains. For someone like that, would it make sense to just start doing yoga, to start stretching? Like what's a kind of easy thing that someone could do to just start to feel better right now?
Outside of, the shameless plug of hire me, I
That's fine
think a
too.
good one, I think a good place to start is try to understand. This is where I try to teach a lot within my own content. Try to understand, first off, why are these stiffnesses happening, right? Or why are we stiff? Because I have another thing. I haven't done a video on it yet. I need to, right, on a whiteboard. But it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I call it my hierarchy of sucky posture. And essentially at the bottom, it starts with habits, then we go symptoms, then we go muscle imbalances, subsystem breakdowns, postural dysfunction, and then total body. And so first off, it's like, okay, well, let's quickly evaluate what did we do that day, right? Because a lot of times if we sat in one position, that's just habits, right? That's habits leading to symptoms. Because if we don't do kind of movement breaks, if we don't take movement breaks, if we don't interrupt the patterns, because our body will adapt to that position, because our body is always trying to adapt to be the most efficient in how we use it. So as much as possible, try and understand, like, okay, what did I do? Because another one that's very common is, let's say you're out gardening. I was just doing this the other day, right? Pulling weeds and you're bent over all day. That could be a stiff, right? Like that you can get very stiff from that. And so in that, if we're talking purely symptoms, a really good one to start is foam rolling. Foam rolling, based on the model that I was taught from the Brooke Bush Institute, is where I got my certification. Shout out to them, by the way. I freaking love their stuff. But what you do is it's called a trigger point. So you will hold on the most tender spot. So let's say, for example, we're dealing with really stiff an anterior pelvic tilt, right? Going back to that example. So a good one, the hip flexors are now pulling the pelvis forward, like tilting the pelvis forward. And so one of the muscles acting on that is the rectus femoris. And so you'll kind of go on that. And typically you'll know very quickly where the tender spot is. So when you hold that, right, because it's been overworked, overactive, the body's adapted and said, another one that I talk about is supply and demand. So if we're talking about, so in order for a muscle to actually shorten and contract, it needs to get a signal from the brain, right, the motor neurons. And so the more demand a specific muscle has, the more the body relies on that specific muscle group. And so in kind of those basic, just habits, just symptoms, just starting there, that's a good one, because what foam rolling will do is when you hold it on that spot, it's called autogenic inhibition. And essentially it forces the muscle to be so tight that the nervous system's like, way too tight, right? Let's relax here. And so that's typically a good place to start, because once you do that, now the muscle is let go, and now you can actually properly lengthen it. And then from there, the other two phases are activation and integration. So we're going to activate muscles opposite that have been on hiatus. So like the glutes is a very common example with anterior pelvic tilt. And so we'll activate those because now we've just taught the body, okay, lengthen here, right? Lengthen those hip flexors. This is what's stiff. Lengthen. Here's neutral. And then we're telling the glutes, like, stop sleeping on the job, right? Do what you're paid to do. And then with that, we integrate or teach the body how to use both in the same context. And essentially, it's integration is one of those movements where you're essentially, it has a lot of stability in it. It has kind of those four elements that I talked about typically. So an example of an integration exercise is what's called the squat to row, where you're holding the band out here, you're basically leaning back, you squat, and then row. And then what you're doing in order to stand up, you're extending the hips, right? You're pulling the hips through, using the glutes to stand back up. And so once you do those four things, then a lot of times, if all you're experiencing is symptoms, you're golden, right? So once you use that 4-step system, you're golden. But if we're dealing with a little bit more postural dysfunction, then you'll probably end up feeling it the next day, or it'll come back eventually. And so that's kind of another golden rule is, how quickly does it go away? Because if all you have is symptoms, right? Like if you have a headache, that doesn't mean you have long-term headaches. That doesn't mean you have chronic headaches typically, right? Maybe dehydration, but that's a different story, of course. And so, yeah, that's kind of a good starting point. Is just move, use that 4-step framework. Yeah.
Really like that last point you made. I think oftentimes the worst part about pain and suffering more generally is the anticipation of future pain. So somebody feels a headache, they feel some kind of an injury, and they start to catastrophize. They think, oh God, this is how I'm going to feel for forever. And so I think that distinction you're drawing between symptoms, right, something that's happening right now versus something that's chronic is important because they don't mean the same thing, right? And if you dive into pain literature, there are plenty of people who, the back is, I think, the best example, right? There's plenty of people who walk around with herniated discs and feel no pain. And there's people who walk around in tremendous pain. And if you do a CT scan of their spine, it's perfectly fine, right? So the pain signals we receive are not necessarily indicative of tissue trauma or broken bones, right? They mean all kinds of things. And I think it's important. I really like, again, that framework you built up. It's important to remember, like, there's a difference between stubbing your toe right now and that pain you're experiencing versus a broken foot versus I've had foot pain for 20 years, right? These are three different phenomenon, and they probably have three different solutions. So let me ask you, again, this is probably a broader question. I'm just curious your thoughts about this. So we're talking about movement, talking about posture, we're talking about mobility. There's a school of thought. I don't know if you ever checked out Barbell Medicine. I used to really like their content. I just haven't found it in a while. They're still good. But one of the things that they used to sort of advocate is that essentially there's no such thing as a wrong way to move. You can injure yourself, you can hurt yourself, but usually what that means is you've engaged in a movement pattern that you haven't trained and you've subjected the body to a stressor it's unaccustomed to. So like a really easy example is like a cat back deadlift, like a super round deadlift. If you always deadlift with a straight back and then you pull too much weight and you round your back, you'll probably hurt your back. But if you always deadlift like a scaredy cat with a round back, and that's always how you train it, you are probably less likely to injure yourself because those tissues get accustomed to feeling that stress in that way. So I'm just curious, I don't know if that's something you've thought about. I'm curious to your reaction.
Yeah, I think that's a really good framework in a general fitness standpoint because that's totally fair, right? If you're not accustomed to moving in a specific position or your technique, you haven't taken the time to really learn the technique and learn how the technique applies to you, right? Because different people have different leverages, different people have different advantages when it comes to those lifts. So I think that's a beautiful framework. If to kind of add kind of little footnote to it, I do also think it kind of depends on, because what posture, kind of tying posture into this is when we're out of alignment, right? Kind of going back to leverages, right? So to give another example, to not beat the dead horse, we'll go forward head posture. So an example here, right? When the for every inch that the head drifts forward, that's now an extra 10 pounds of tension now placed on the back of the neck. And so because another thing with it is trust. So the body, like we kind of already touched on before, the body will adapt and move based on how we've taught it to move. So if we've constantly overused the lower back, if we're used to being in an overly extended position, then if we don't take the time to learn that technique, take the time to slow it down, break it down, do it with proper form before ever going close to what our maxes are, I do think that also will play into it because, right, like if you have, I'll take my water bottle here, for example, right, when we hold the water bottle closer here, it's not quite as heavy. But then the farther we drift out here and here, that's more tension placed on the shoulder and it does naturally get a little bit heavier. And so tying the element of trust into it, just like in a lot of my videos, my entire goal is to get people to trust me, right? I want to show people I know what I'm talking about. And so in order to do that, I have to demonstrate my knowledge. And so another way is we also have to demonstrate to our brains, to our nervous system, that like if we're in that overextended position, to rely on the abs a little bit more, right? To rely on the core. And so I do think that does end up tying into it. I think that's all I want to add to it. But yeah, I do really like that framework.
AJ here. If you're enjoying this interview, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it makes a huge difference. And if you're looking to transform your body and your mind without jeopardizing your health, consider hiring me as a coach. Links in the video description. Appreciate you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm thinking about, I've seen YouTube videos. There was a time when I was like watching chiropractor videos, like not informative videos, just like dudes making adjustments on people, right? Because it's just kind of interesting clickbait content. And I remember seeing some people, a gentleman in particular, who just had this tremendous forward head posture, so much so that all of his supporting musculature was essentially locked. Right? Like he had lost the ability to turn his head to a certain extent because he was just in this forward tilt position at all times. And I think, again, it circles back to this point you're making about the body being adaptable. Is that if you tell your body to do the same thing again and again and again and again, it will in fact do that, and it will develop compensatory mechanisms to make sure that it can do that long term. And the problem is that, yeah, like again, it's right. Is there a wrong posture? Maybe not, but there's inefficient postures. And if you teach yourself one thing that's inefficient all the time, you're going to be stuck doing that. And I think to me, that's the key. Is part of having good posture, or mobility, or flexibility is being more robust. You can do more things in more situations. And I think that's the key that I think that is hard to grasp, because I do think that people, like traditionally when you think about posture, you just think like, I need to stand like this. I need to have my shoulders back all the time, right? Like you're in the military. But I don't think that's how you conceptualize good. Do you teach people to do that all the time and nothing else? I don't think so, right?
No, absolutely not.
Right. Right. So yeah. But it's a tough thing. Where we watch military movies. Maybe people went to Catholic school, right? Like they're taught to do this, and that makes it hard to conceptualize it. So when you are working with people, because you talked about your work as a coach, and just when you're communicating, what are some of the common problems that you see people develop? Maybe as a result of sitting too much, or maybe from lifting, or both.
Yeah. So you definitely hit it there. The most common thing, right, in a world where we're becoming more and more sedentary, that is the ultimate, like just like a car, right? Our bodies are meant to move. So the more it holds still, like the more problems do arise. And so that is where, because we've kind of talked about all the different techniques in order to improve posture, but in order to kind of going back to that hierarchy, when we're in that stage of habits, it's like, well, how do we prevent ever getting to that postural dysfunction? And so one of literally the most common things is truly move. That's one of the only times where I like the saying motion is lotion, because like when we sit in that position, we do get locked up, right? Our muscles are like, okay, this is neutral. This is how we want to sit. Cool. Right? We're going to get really good at this, right? Maybe not so much at picking up stuff, but we're going to be the best, most professional sitters in the world. And so literally, and it can be really simple because it's just a pattern interrupt, right? Just like a reminder. Think of it as the equivalent to a wristband to the wrist when you're doing some kind of bad habit, right? It's like, aha. And so for when we're sitting, right, that anterior pelvic tilt, that over usage of the lower back, literally just rolling the shoulders, taking one of the general rules that I was taught. I think it was every 40 to 60 minutes, which is not always the most doable, but if you can just like stand up, even just in your chair, rotate, only using your upper body. Start when you're walking, right? If someone's going from a seated to standing desk, standing up, doing some glute marches, right? Reapplying those muscles that do often go on hiatus, and remind the body like, hey, like don't use this so much, use that too, right? That supply and demand of it, right? Because our body's business, we want to make money. We got to make sure the demand meets the supply, or the supply meets the demand, excuse me.
I like that. That was awesome. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Are you comfortable speaking a little bit about geriatric needs? Is that something that you think about or have looked into? Honestly, I just asked because I saw my mom this past week, and she is a lovely old lady, but she is an old lady, and so for populations that maybe have bone issues, right, or maybe just have a longer history of lack of use, what should their concerns be, or how should they approach improving their mobility or their posture?
One thing, so I took this class one time, and it was building up to an exercise physiology style of class. And one thing that they kind of always talked about was, and this is not to suggest like put words in your mouth by any means, but there was like different studies talking about like how a lot of people often will assume like with age, yes, there does come kind of like that lessened function to a certain degree when it comes to movement. And so, but there was in this class they were talking a lot about like there were studies showing like how I don't even know what the like what word to use, but like more capable than like we realize. And so from a posture perspective, because that's where it does get kind of tricky, and that's where when I was at that orthopedic center, it was like because to a certain degree with that wear and tear that builds up and builds up from lack of information out there in the world when it comes to the world of posture to prevent ever getting to that stage, that's where it does get tricky because it also kind of depends on what kind of pains they're experiencing. And so and that's one of the first things that I even screen for. It's like, okay, because dull, achy, that's kind of what I work with. But even then, it's like, is it dull, achy all the time? Because a story based on this is there was one time I had a hip injury that started off as dull and achy. You stretch it, you rest, and it goes away. That's typically a little bit more within my scope, which there's still caution to it. And so, but then eventually, because of the wear and tear, it eventually got to a point where it was dull and achy, whether I was awake, whether I was asleep. It would wake up because of pain. And so it really kind of depends on the kind of pain. Because at that stage, like the wear and tear is built up so long that it's like it's really tough to speak on it from even just a general perspective. But if they are in that stage where it is that dull and achy inconsistently, then I would, yeah, at first, right, just a little bit movement, a little mobility, a little flexibility, reintroduce the body to those kind of movements. And this is why within my own 12-week coaching program that I just opened up, we start off in, I call it the feel good phase, where I ease into it. Cause I think that's a big issue that even myself used to have a bad habit in. It's like, okay, I started a new program, 20 sets, right? 20 minutes, 20, and like even just starting off small, seeing how that feels. So if they feel good after it, right, kind of applying that 4-step framework, the foam rolling, the stretching, the activation, integration, right, that kind of thing, light resistance training. If doing that does help, then like start to really ramp it up. But then if not, like especially if it makes it worse, then orthopedics is the good. And so yeah, I apologize. That was kind of a long way to not fully answer the question, but at the same time, it's very hard to speak on the more general side of it.
No, I think that was a good answer. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And it's important to recognize that if your foot, like let's take an extreme example. If your foot is broken, no amount of arch support exercises is going to make your foot feel better. And if you have arthritis, right, in the case, my mom has some arthritis, right? That's not there may be things she can do, right? Even to the point you made earlier about foam rolling, there may be things she can do to sort of reset her nervous system and get out of those pain habits. But you're not going to repair damaged bone and tendon through stretching. That's not a real thing, right? So I guess, and that does kind of lead me to a question. When should someone, and you talked about this a little bit now, when should someone seek a medical intervention versus trying to fix it on by themselves? Because I definitely think as a lifter, that's something I personally struggle with, right? Like I don't ever want to go to the fucking doctor. You know what I mean? So
Right.
like I always
100%,
want to do
100%.
everything myself. So what are some models or rules that maybe people should try to abide by?
That's a great question. Definitely look into kind of like we said, that pain scale, like evaluate what kind of pain it is, what happens when we do start the movement. Yeah, this is definitely where it's kind of that like fine line of like, oh, it's hard to gauge scope of practice within that. In terms of, I mean, the biggest thing that I want to kind of encourage and urge is start now, regardless of where you're at in your fitness journey, in your general health and wellness journey, is at the very least just right because posture to give a simple definition is literally the way that our body holds itself both while moving and sitting, which also relates to what movements our body resists while moving. And so really, and that's something I'm really trying to like hone in on as unbiased as I possibly can as a posture coach, really, is, start as soon as you can when it comes to the posture. I mean, if you're new to the fitness journey, it's like, because it kind of comes down to like what's a universal reason that people do start their health and wellness journey, do start lifting, right? Because even when we go into aesthetic, strength, right, all these different categories, they all come down into health and wellness. And whether that's from a mental health perspective, because there's plenty of studies relating how posture does affect that. Because, for example, in rounded shoulders, what does happen is it ends up inhibiting breathing, even with forward head posture. And so breathing mechanics starts to take a little bit of a hit. And so what that leads to is, because you're only chest breathing, you're not getting full deep breaths. Your body's put into a low level state of fight or flight. And so a lot of, it's like, some people be like, I'm just stressed. I'm really tense today. Yeah, but it's because you've been telling your body to be stressed, to be tense in those situations. And so as much as possible, if they're not in that stage where it's, starting to really true pain, in that dull, achy all the time, no matter what you do, sharpshooting, stabbing, burning, shocking is another one that I've heard before. And so really, as soon as possible, like, start now when it comes to posture, even just apply little mechanics at a time, just introduce it. And I think, because I truly think that the best fix is preventing it altogether.
That's beautiful. Yeah, that resonates a lot with me because I actually have started the past probably like 8 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, I started doing yoga regularly. I did it this afternoon. And I have had the thought, every week I do it, I've had the thought, man, what if I had just started doing this 5 years ago? Right? Like instead of waiting until like my hip hurts or whatever, right? If I had just been slowly getting better at this over time, instead of getting stiffer and more muscle bound, what a difference that would have made. People always bastardize this, but there's like a Chinese proverb that like the best time to plant a tree is right now. And if not right now, the best time to plant it is tomorrow, right? Or no, sorry. The best time to plant a tree is yesterday, if not right now, right? Like that's the thing is be proactive. It's always going to be better to try to fix things before they become real issues rather than to wait and be passive. So maybe just along that line, kind of a last theoretical exercise. We talked about this a little bit. My foot hurts, right? Like I've got plantar fasciitis. I don't need you to give me a medical diagnosis, but I do notice that for me personally, I seem to benefit from balance exercises. Like my left foot is the foot that hurts, and so I notice it if I stand on my left foot, it's less stable than my right foot. So that's something that to me seems like, okay, this is a pretty clear deficit. What are things I can do to just make my foot and my ankle stronger and more stable?
You definitely hit a very good starting point. Is first off, like, noting the issue and then kind of testing. I think that's really one of the biggest parts, is finding out right away where the weakness is. That's a lot of times where a lot of people, they don't really know, right? You can't fix anything until you really look into it. And so from that stabilizing standpoint, as well as kind of touching on that drill I mentioned earlier with that stability, with the arch drill, what we call it, single leg pendulum swings. Another one is going, I really like this one from a stabilizing standpoint and integration standpoint. It's heel elevated split squats, because that one actually, one, your knee doesn't go too far past the toes. And that one's really good because that is a common issue when there is a lack of mobility with the ankles and even with the hips in general. That puts more strain, more stress on the knees. And so that this front foot elevated split squats is a really good one to start as well, because then it also forces you to use your calf and the shin muscles, right? Like the tibialis muscles, forces them to be stabilizers and keep you stable in that. So that's another specific example. The other one, when it comes to, because you mentioned earlier duck feet, so to go through kind of the 4-step framework with that one, it's called corrective exercise, using the corrective exercise, right? So first off, foam rolling. When duck feet happens, the main muscle that's acting on that is the calf, specifically on the lateral side. The calf and the fibularis muscles. There's another name. I think it's like peroneals or something like that. I try to stick with fibularis. Those ones, those are the best ones to foam roll, because a lot of times, because I've had this before too, this was like a really big issue for me. And so you'll take a foam roller. I prefer a lacrosse ball. Foam roller works great too if you can, but you usually have to prop yourself up on your hand in order to get full weight on there. But the best place to start is foam rolling that calf, and then the other one is stretching the calf in a position where your feet are angled here because your
Mm.
calf is both an everter, right? Turns the foot out. So it literally puts it in a position when your toes are inwards. It does the opposite of what the calf does. So then when you go to stretch it after releasing it, after telling your nervous system, hey, let's tone this down here. It's a little too tight. Then it helps it find new length. And then that's when we stay in that position. One of my favorites is you can hold onto a wall or brace yourself against the wall and then start doing toe raises. Toe raise is another good one, especially in that angle because we are literally doing everything opposite of that calf, of that portion that is causing the duck feet. And then from there, that's when I really like to add in that front foot elevated split squat is my go-to. And so that's hopefully a good specific framework in there. But yes, yeah, I think that touches pretty much everything I'd
Yeah, yeah.
want to go over
And
there.
for the front foot, how elevated should it be? Is it like more a squat shoe, or you mean actual like a box?
I prefer. I think it's the Rogue has like a pretty thick.
Uh-huh.
Those like pretty thick 45-pound plates have been my like that's been the perfect elevation for me specifically because if I go too much, then it does really strain the knee, and like my quads are like this is too much length. But yeah, just enough elevation that you really feel it because it's also good from because I'm not much of a hypertrophy expert, but it's really a lengthened partial kind of style lift because the quad is consistently in that stretched position, and so it's like that's a really good quad burn for anyone out there who's really big into hypertrophy and stuff.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I've done sissy squats at various times, and that has a similar kind of idea. You get even more forward knee bend though, and so if your ankle is weak and unstable, it's probably not a great lift for a lot of people. Makes sense though. Question, maybe just my last question. We talked a bit about your athletic background, right? Like playing football. I know you were doing some powerlifting. You're really interested in this now. Are there things as an athlete that you personally really want to accomplish in the next 6 to 12 months, right? Are there levels of mobility or strength? Like how do you personally think about that right now?
For me personally, I had to take a really deep dive because, as I explained to you kind of before this episode began, is I did powerlifting and I went to the extreme. Like I got really big. I got to that like truly like maximal effort lift where the technique's down. It's truly just how heavy can you lift. And it was just like, it was just affecting. And so I'm trying to find a way to balance as much as health and wellness, really, just because since I've started this business, I've had, I struggle to even walk away. It's sometimes like I have times where I'll go to fill up my water bottle and I can't fill it up all the way. I'm like, no, back to work, right? Like we got work to do. And so I'm trying to find that like balance of how much can I do to stay healthy, stay fit, continue losing weight is kind of my big one right now. Because I've never done an official cut, given that I did football for a decade. So it was like, and then I did a bulk on powerlifting. And so the big one is try to minimalize as much as what I'm doing because that's what's interesting about fitness as a whole is you can do so many different things at the same time to achieve so many different goals. It's just slower. And so truly the framework right now, because deadlifts, freaking love deadlifts. I love it from once you've fixed posture. That's a really good one in an integration style lift, especially with anterior pelvic tilt, because the better you get at using your core, especially in that kind of hinge motion, it's just like, plus it's hella addicting. Like that is, I can't, if all I had to do was deadlifts every single day, like I'd be good. I am trying to. There was a post that I had that broke for over 6 million, which I was not expecting, and a lot of people are like, "Bro, your arms look so big. You're on trend, aren't you?" I'm like, no. The funny thing about that is I had a pillow just underneath it, so it was literally like my arms were bigger at the time because I was still like just fresh off powerlifting, but it was literally because stuff was so I looked way bigger than I was, and I'm like,
Yeah.
that is my goal physique with arms. So deadlift that, and then we mentioned hunting before this podcast and rucking and being able to move and actually not feel like a statue walking around this big old bulky heavy. Yeah.
Very cool. Have you ever heard of the athlete Tom Haviland?
Yes, I love
Yeah.
his stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think any any warm-blooded human being who sees that dude's content is like, "Oh man, I wish I could do that." And like live that
Right.
and like live
Right.
that life, right? Because he's basically, as far as I can tell, he lives on a farm in the woods, rucks and lifts stuff all day. Like it's just, like it's just so cool, man.
Right. He's
Yeah.
got like the ultimate like dream life. Yeah, because I
Yeah.
saw it on Mitchell Hooper's Strongman's
Yeah.
podcast here at YouTube. He was talking about him. He's like, bro, he could probably compete in strongman and do pretty well, and he's doing it like it seems just for the fun of the game. Like he just really enjoys it, and it's just like it's crazy to watch. Like you said, he's like there's all over. It's like man, like that's cool. Like cool to you, kudos to you, because I'm sure that took a lot of hard work to get to that point. But he also doesn't. It's deceivingly strong as well. It's crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah, it's super cool. Well, thanks, man. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted me to ask you, or anything you want to cover? No is always a valid answer.
Yeah, I'm just trying to make sure because I thought I'm just trying to make sure going back like reviewing my mental notes to see what we did cover just to make sure because I can't really think of anything that we didn't cover because I also gave really thorough answers that covered more than just the question. So I apologize for that.
No, you did great, man.
Um, yeah, I think that kind of covers it.
Awesome, dude. Well, thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, I appreciate you for having me on. It's awesome.